Hello, my name is Joel Martez. I'm an affiliate faculty member here at Southwestern College. I teach business quality management and operations management. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about supply chain challenges in a post-COVID-19 America. Now, of course, when I say post-COVID-19, I don't necessarily mean when the pandemic is completely over and completely resolved, but sort of some of the challenges that America will see as we come out of the initial phases of the recovery for COVID-19. So as I'm presenting this, it's the end of October in 2020, and there's still, I think, a lot to be determined about the course of the virus in the country. But there's quite a few interesting academic elements to supply chain impacts that we've seen already, and things that I think we're going to see in the next couple of months that are going to be really interesting from an academic supply chain perspective. So we'd like to talk through a couple of those details and discuss a little bit of that. So what we're going to talk about is what is a supply chain, make sure we're kind of all on the same page with the definition there. Talk a little bit about what was so different about COVID-19 from a supply chain perspective as opposed to any other major supply constraints or challenges that we've seen. And then talk about two of the bigger things that you'll probably see on the news in the next coming months, one being the e-commerce ship-ageddon, or a major challenge for parcel delivery carriers such as UPS and FedEx to make their holiday shipping commitments for e-commerce companies. And then cold chain challenges. We'll talk a little bit more about what the cold chain is. So first off, supply chain, like I said, it's all activities and supplies that are needed to deliver the final product to the customer. So sourcing, purchasing the materials, finished goods, transportation, the warehousing, distribution, and delivery to the customer, whether that's delivery in store or a delivery shipment to the customer's home, the entire process going backwards from the customer all the way to the very beginning sourcing stages of that product. That entire operation, that whole thing is a supply chain. And what we highlighted and what we learned a lot during the pandemic was that supply chains have a ton of links in them. And what that means is all it takes in a lot of cases is one critical link to break to start seeing things falling apart in a big way. So let's talk about some of the specific impacts that COVID-19 caused and what we saw from the supply chain perspective. Not surprising to anybody or news to anybody, were obviously massive changes in the workforce dynamics and in the labor market. The biggest thing to call out there was that although unemployment rose at historical rates, and obviously it was very challenging for a lot of people in the country, it was unevenly distributed across countries. So when you see a more general recession, such as the one that happened in 2008, unemployment tends to be a little more evenly distributed. The entire economy kind of slows down, so all jobs are kind of slowed at a relatively equal rate. Of course, there's exceptions, but as a general rule, unemployment kind of spreads evenly. In a lot of critical functions within supply chain, some of these positions were surging, transportation, warehousing, retail, large companies, your Walmart, Target, Amazon, Costco, companies like that were going on a hiring spree, trying to increase their workforce. And of course, the labor market didn't have enough qualified individuals or experienced individuals available. So then these companies are either forced to work with short staffing or to potentially take employees from other sectors, such as, restaurants that had a disproportionately large unemployment rate. And then there's a cost to the companies to train those unexperienced employees into a functional setting that they can work in. So a lot of challenges around labor, and I think we're going to still continue to see that play out over the next couple of months. Changes in workplace productivity due to COVID-19 protocols. And of course, this isn't to question the validity or the necessity of these protocols. I'm just highlighting the fact that anytime you have increased safety, cleaning procedures, staffing processes, so, a common one is if somebody in a lot of workplaces tests positive or has known exposure, they may not be allowed to come back to work for 2 weeks or until they get a negative test result. All of those changes limit the participation or the attendance rate for certain employees, and that could really throttle your workforce, especially if you happen to get an unlucky breakout and have a large number of employees infected at the same time. There's a major challenge to how many people you can bring, again, tying into an already constrained labor market that can really put employers in a bind. Another major challenge was inconsistent policy implementation between states And again, my intent with this is not to question which states did it better or which states did it worse. I want to stay away from the political side of it, but the reality was certain states were more lenient on some of their protocols and certain states were stricter. And where that really gets challenging is, let's say you have stores in a state like Washington State or California that shut down rather aggressively, rather quickly. Well, if those stores can't get deliveries from a warehouse or distribution center in Arizona or Texas, maybe a state that didn't shut down quite as aggressively early on, there are challenges where those shipments can't get delivered. So now you have inventory or product at a warehouse or distribution center that can't move, that can create capacity concerns in the warehouse. On the other side, if your stores are in Arizona or Texas, they're open for business, but your distribution center is in California. And if your distribution center or warehouse wasn't deemed an essential business, that warehouse could shut down. And where you saw this was some collateral businesses. So if you, let's say a pharmacy had a transportation company and the transportation company, which is a third party, wasn't considered or chose to shut down, now you have a pharmacy who, even though they're a essential business, weren't able to participate or weren't able to get the transportation support they needed. That could be really challenging as well. And again, you see there the definition of essential worker varying from state to state created some problems. And then the word that I think everybody has used to the end of the world with this pandemic is unprecedented. And I almost hate to use it, but it is just the perfect word for what we saw with demand pattern signals. Anybody who tried to buy toilet paper or paper towels in March can definitely understand that the demand shifted across a whole ton of different categories, and the demand quantity shifted, and it makes it really hard on these models are built for most big companies do a lot of their forecasting using highly precise and complex models that utilize a ton of historical data. Again, you're thinking of regression towards the mean, so it's over time going to smooth out these outliers. Well, when an outlier comes along that is so unprecedentedly large that it breaks the models, you're in for a whole different kind of challenge. The other thing in that first bullet you can see under demand pattern is that, the mode shifted huge in a massive way. So a ton of people went from buying things in store to buying things online, and whether that was because they had a fear of going out in public or they were concerned about the health aspects of going to stores, or stores just didn't have the product, all of a sudden a lot of companies are shifting. Maybe companies who had a small online and e-commerce was a small part of their business, they've now shifted a huge chunk of their business onto online without all the infrastructure needed to do that. Those are a couple of the key challenges with COVID-19. So one of these that kind of tie up, or one of these that line up and build to, is going to be the e-commerce ship-ageddon. So that's a phrase that I've started seeing a couple of weeks ago. This article that I linked was one of the main ones. But what basically is happening is you've got all of these factors that I talked about. Increased e-commerce activity. So people are shifting more online. You have a increased demand for transportation tied into both e-commerce and traditional retail processes, matched with lower labor pools or labor that's less qualified in these sectors than the demand really needs. So you have just a complete mismatch of supply and demand. Next day air grew by 20% versus a standard of 8% year over year. You can see there in Q1 of 2020, and that trend really continued. So what a lot of shippers are seeing is they're seeing volumes that have exceeded their forecast several years down the road. So maybe UPS and FedEx are seeing volumes that they perhaps expected to see in 2023, 2024, jumping 3 or 4 years all at once. And obviously there's a lot of long-term capital expenditure projects to build the infrastructure to allow these companies to be able to handle this kind of volume. To accelerate that by 3 to 4 years is just obviously going to create a ton of problems. But you can see here some things that are driving into this. Again, the increased e-commerce activity. One of the big things you see there is that expected CapEx investment at the e-commerce level is projected to grow 45% year over year. So that was from a 2018 research. and and you can see there's 33% of distribution and fulfillment centers projected increased hiring. So that's the trajectory that the industry was on before COVID. And COVID basically took a supercharger and put it on all of our supply chains and tried to accelerate everything years beyond the current pace. And again, labor security is going to continue to be a major challenge. Big networks can use up to 50% of their workforce as a seasonal or temporary worker. And you'll see this particularly with a major e-commerce company. That's a good example would be Amazon. They rely a lot on temporary workers. But again, you'll see that inability to attract and retain qualified hourly workforce is a major challenge. It was the top challenge cited in this survey that I've linked here. So you have not only labor competition within the industry, but you have to think Amazon and UPS and FedEx are essentially kind of fighting for the same workforce and the same skills. So you're going to start seeing everybody suffering from this lack of labor in the industry that just doesn't match this unprecedented demand that we're seeing. Okay, so wanted to wrap up the presentation by talking a little bit about cold chain. And a cold chain is, like you may assume, a supply chain where the products are kept in temperature-controlled settings throughout the entire chain. That temperature could vary depending on what it is, but anything that requires refrigeration from manufacturing to the customer is considered a cold chain. COVID-19 has seen a huge increase in cold chain demand due to fresh fruit and vegetable purchases and a decline in restaurants, which actually increases your packaged food demand to grocery stores. The other thing to keep an eye on, and I'll talk about this again here in a second, pharmaceutical demand for cold chain is about 48% of the value of cold chain revenue. And then a sudden increase on cold chain capacity could increase the cost for grocers. So the important reason to think about that is that if pharmaceutical demand is about half of the value of half of the revenue stream of the entire cold chain, it has roughly equal buying power or weight to push around within the industry compared to grocery stores or grocers. That's going to become very, very intriguing if a vaccine, which COVID-19 vaccine from every indication that we've seen, is going to have to be temperature controlled. The amount of capacity that this will take, there just simply isn't capacity in the cold chain right now in the country. So something is going to have to give. Understanding the urgency for this vaccine and the necessity for it means that, and the pharmaceutical companies having the dollars to push to buy that capacity, means that realistically what we're going to see is a crunch on capacity for cold chain distribution for less essential for food and some of those products. That's going to increase ultimately either lower the revenue or lower the profits for grocery stores or increase the price on food for the average consumer. So to kind of conclude, a couple of big things to keep an eye on over the next couple of months. And like I said, we're a couple of days away from the beginning of November, which means we're getting into the holiday peak retail season. So it'll be interesting to watch how this develops from a supply chain perspective and see what we can learn here. Things to watch out for are going to be continued investment in e-commerce automation to navigate this labor challenge. So if companies see long-term challenges meeting their labor demands, one of the best ways to solve that is by using automation that lowers their total labor need. Again, the caveat there is that that's going to increase the cost of barrier for entry for smaller e-commerce companies. So your Walmarts and Amazons of the world are going to be making a ton of ground up over their competition here because they have the money to invest in automation. Challenges for parcel carriers, of course, FedEx and UPS are two of the biggest in the country, but you're going to see that increased demand, and there's the opportunity for smaller regional carriers to really gain a lot of new business if they can deliver for these big retailers during peak. And then continued transportation constraints driven by the driver shortages and continued import increases. So you'll see as the supply chains try to restabilize and these models try to rebuild based on the new demand structures, we're going to keep seeing imports at least probably for the first half of 2021, especially to the West Coast ports that are importing from China. That volume is going to continue to increase, which is going to continue to constrain our transportation bandwidth in the country. And then volatility in prices for cold chain, like we talked about, driven a lot by the vaccine, but also just, again, by the same shortages in transportation and drivers that we're seeing. So those are a couple of big things to look out for. I have attached a couple of references in this presentation, so you can check out a couple articles that are related or read the papers that I based this research on. If you have any other further questions, I'm available through the college. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and best of luck.